So without further ado, I'll let Melissa speak.
Some of you kind of commented on the way in. I thought my name sounded familiar or my face looked familiar, and yes, I spoke before Congress earlier this week. There was a hearing called before the Senate, or the House Judiciary, where they entitled the hearing called "The Threats to Women's Reproductive Rights in America," and I showed up. As you can imagine, I was outnumbered 6-2. There were 6 pro-abortion witnesses and there were 2 pro-life witnesses, one of whom was myself. But if any of you saw video, you'll see that it didn't go as well as they probably planned that hearing to, because they brought in a Hollywood actress who shared her own abortion story. And later in the midst of questioning, one of the representatives asked her, thank you for sharing your story, but could you talk to me a little bit about when you think someone like Melissa Ohden's life began? When did her rights as a woman begin? And you can see her audibly stuttering, stammering, trying to find that spot in her brain, right, where the answer might come up, and she never came up with the answer. And so I think that's what we see as legislation is being introduced here in New York and Virginia, Vermont, right? The list could go on and on, Illinois. You see now that people are having a hard time with the truth about life, right? On one side of the fence, you see people who are introducing aggressive legislation. And then, of course, I'm grateful to see that the pro-life response to that is to fight fire with fire and pass abortion laws that save lives, right? Like pro-life laws of the heartbeat bills and other pieces of legislation. But I think what's important for all of us to remember is that no matter what battles are raging politically, places like EMC have to exist. Now we're hearing this discussion of what a post-Roe America would look like. And we were talking at our table, I used to say, it might not happen in my lifetime. My hope is always that it happens in my children's lifetime. But I now believe that it could happen in my lifetime, that we see in America post-Roe versus Wade, which is we have to recognize that places like EMC must exist, and they're going to have to function at even a higher level than what they do now. And so when you look at history being made here in your community with this center being started, know that you are on the right side of history. And when we look back on this post-Roe America, what you're doing right here is going to be part of that narrative that people are able to share. So what an exciting time for me to be with all of you. And you guys deserve a round of applause for being here. But I want to share with you the story that not everybody in Congress got to hear this week, because literally I get 5 minutes when I speak before Congress. And there's about a lifetime of a story that I always want to share with them. And I know that I don't have to convince any of you that fighting for lives like mine is important. But what I do want to do is share with you the story that we don't often hear about. So on the days that get difficult, as you're starting this center here in this community, when you're wondering if it's worth it, that maybe you remember my face, you remember my story. I can age myself really quickly by telling you guys when I survived a failed abortion, so we'll just get that part over really quickly. I'm almost 42, it's okay. I'm almost 42. I survived a failed saline infusion abortion in 1977. And what I know about my birth mother is that really she fits most statistics when it comes to abortion. My birth mother looked an awful lot like the women who come through the doors at EMC still today. My birth mother was 19. She was a college student. She wasn't married to my biological father. And sadly, I now know that she fits one of the greatest statistics that people don't want to talk about in our society, and that's coercion. As I shared with Congress this week, there was a study, I think it was back in 2013, Dr. Lanfranchi, if anyone follows her work, published that 48% of women report being coerced into their abortion. I've seen numbers from the Elliott Institute that report out that 64% of women identify feeling pressured into their abortion. I've seen other statistics here recently that talked about how women identified that the reason why they had an abortion was to keep someone else happy. The number was astronomical, well over 50%. And those are numbers that we don't talk about in our society. We also don't talk about those psychosocial reasons that drive women to have abortions. Those very reasons that EMC is working to help women address on a daily basis. But my birth mother, we now know, was actually not just coerced to have her abortion with me, but it was literally forced upon her against her will. My maternal grandparents were prominent people in their community in a little town called Sioux City, Iowa. Anybody actually ever heard of it before? Yeah, Iowa, where's that, right? I know, I get that a lot. But my grandparents were very prominent people in the community. My maternal grandmother was a prominent nurse, to be particular. She had a really good working relationship with the local abortionist. And so when they found out my birth mother was pregnant, they forced the abortion upon her against her will, bypassing hospital regulations and procedures, believing nobody would ever find out that it wasn't her choice, and most certainly nobody would ever hear from me personally. I know many of you remember the saline infusion abortion from years ago. You know, it's been really interesting as I battle so publicly for life. I've actually had people say, oh, you can't listen to women like Melissa. That's not relevant anymore. Oh yes, it is still relevant. It is still performed sometimes, this type of abortion procedure, but I always remind people, whenever you're ending the life of another human being in the womb, it's always going to be relevant to me. So they don't get to use that as an excuse. But it is not a procedure that's performed routinely anymore, quite simply because too many of us survived it. For those of you that aren't aware of what it involves, that saline infusion abortion involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison and scald me to death. Usually the procedure lasted about 72 hours. The child would soak in that toxic salt solution until their life was effectively ended, and then they would induce labor with the intent of expelling that deceased child from the womb. What we actually know through my medical records is that I didn't soak in that toxic salt solution for just 3 days. I actually soaked in it for 5. They tried time and time again over that 5-day period to induce my birth mother's labor, and they did not succeed until the 5th day. I was delivered at St. Luke's Hospital, which is not a Catholic hospital, but it was religiously affiliated, unfortunately. But I was born in the final step of that abortion procedure at St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa. They believed that I would be delivered as a successful abortion, otherwise known as a deceased child. And in this world that we're living in right now, where people are having these conversations about late-term abortion and infanticide, we hear these rumblings, right, where people are saying, well, children aren't left to die after an abortion. This doesn't happen. But I'm here to tell you that it does. My parents were told early on that when I was delivered alive in that abortion procedure, the abortionist looked upon my live birth and demanded that I be left to die. Unfortunately, we now know a lot more about those circumstances. And I know now that it wasn't the abortionist who gave that demand about my life. It was my own grandmother. My grandmother was there when I was delivered in the final step of the abortion procedure. Coming face to face with her firstborn grandchild that day, she is the one who demanded that I be left to die. And I don't share that with you for you to cast judgment upon her or to condemn her. But I share that with you so that we can understand that this is what abortion has done to our society. That people make life and death decisions about lives like mine every single day, regardless of their connection. And no matter what decisions my grandmother made about my life, I don't hate her. I love her as a fellow broken human being, knowing that she probably never would have loved me in return. And I'm forever thankful that no matter what decision she did make about my life, there were nurses on staff at that hospital who defied her orders. My mom and dad had heard about a couple of nurses over the years who had intervened to save my life, and I've been so blessed because just about 2 years ago now, a nurse contacted me directly. She had read my book and she said, Melissa, you know, I've been following you for years on social media, and I always wondered if you were the baby that I remembered from St. Luke's Hospital. And she said, after reading your book, I know without a doubt that it's you. She wasn't in the room that day. Isn't it amazing? This is what Congress needs to hear, right? She wasn't in the room that day when I was delivered alive, but she was working in the neonatal intensive care unit. And she said, I'll never forget it. She said the door to the NICU came flying open. This tall blonde nurse had you in her arms, and she shouted out, I'll clean up the language a little bit. She shouted out, "That darn Dr. Kelberg messed up." That was my abortionist. And she went on and she said she just kept gasping for breath. She just kept gasping for breath, and so I couldn't just leave her there to die. Sounds an awful lot like Governor Northam's comments out of Virginia earlier this year, right? Let's make a child comfortable and have a conversation about them. And I've let him know that gasping for breath is never a comfortable situation for a baby. But that's how I ultimately made it to the NICU that day. I believe God had the right people on staff at that hospital who were willing to say yes. And you would never know by looking at me tonight, right? That I should have been poisoned and scalded to death in the womb. You would never know that when she whisked me off to the NICU that day, the prognosis for my life was very poor. When I was delivered alive in that abortion procedure, I weighed a little less than 3 pounds. I weighed 2 pounds, 14 ounces, which indicated to the doctors that my birth mother was much further along in her pregnancy than the 18 to 20 weeks that the abortionist had written on my medical records. So a neonatologist actually remarked that he estimated me to be about 31 weeks. 31 weeks gestational age when I was delivered in that abortion procedure. And I'm not alone in that. Most abortion survivors that I work with in my ministry, the Abortion Survivors Network, most of us are survivors of late-term abortions. And so we take laws like what happened here in New York very seriously because we know what it means to lives like ours. But when I was delivered alive in that abortion procedure, I suffered from a multitude of health issues. Severe respiratory, liver problems. I suffered from seizures for an extended period of time. The doctors actually thought I had a fatal heart defect initially because of the amount of distress that my body was under. And I think we live in a culture that hears those things and still tries to pass judgment, right? People will actually say to me sometimes, well, Melissa, who's going to love someone like that? Well, people like you and me, people like my mom and dad. I'm actually adopted. My parents adopted me knowing full well what the story of my life was. And, you know, I think the most important thing my parents ever did in my life was love me. I'm a convert to the church. You know, all this talk about unwanted, unloved babies, and we always say, yeah, there's an answer to that, love them. No, want them, right? There is a solution. But my parents loved me radically and raised me with a heart of mercy. I often tell my parents they're really on their way to entering the church, right? They just have never been sure of that. But my parents raised me with a heart of mercy towards my biological parents. What they didn't do was tell me the story of my survival because they were afraid of how that truth would affect my life. So I grew up knowing I was adopted. What I didn't know until I was 14 was that I had survived that failed abortion. When I was 14, I found out the truth of my survival, quite simply because my older sister faced an unplanned pregnancy herself. My older sister is adopted. And even though we were raised in a home with very firm beliefs about the sanctity of life and the gift of adoption, like many women who come through the doors of EMC, right? She had a lot of fears and anxieties. And so she was considering every option, which included an abortion. When our parents found out that she was facing that decision, they decided to tell her the story of my survival. They wanted her to understand how big of a decision she was facing in her life. That was about 28 years ago now that my sister was told the story of my survival. My oldest nephew will be 27 next month. How amazing, right? I know that it was the love and support of our family by and large, and the truth about how abortion affects people's lives that really affected her. And I am forever grateful, not only that she chose to carry him and parent him, but that he came forward in our lives at such a time, because that's how ultimately I found out the story of my survival. She let it slip to me. I had to ask our parents for more to the story of my life. And you know, a lot of people ask me in hindsight, didn't you ever see news like this coming? No. And I can tell you absolutely not. Never can anybody expect to hear those words, Missy, your biological mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it. I now work with survivors around the world. Most survivors do tend to find out at a young age, but I work with survivors who have had abortions themselves before they find out that they survived an abortion. So I understand the nature and the complication that comes with this news. And I'm the first person to admit, years ago, I didn't want to be the girl who survived a failed abortion. But I've come to accept this vocation and this calling that God has on my life, and I'm forever grateful that He's trusted me with His work in this world. But I stumbled on this journey. But in the midst of my own suffering, God taught me a lot about the love of other people. And so by the time I went away to college, I went looking for my biological parents. I started trying to obtain my medical records. Most survivors will never have any medical record. And I work a lot in our world to educate people about that. That's been one of those comments lately, right? Well, children are always provided medical care, or this doesn't happen. And I'm saying, prove me wrong, right? Show me the data, start tracking it, don't lie about it. Because that's essentially what's happened in our world. The abortion industry has done a good job of making sure people like me don't have any documentation about what happened to us. I didn't know back then that I would be one of the only, actually, 2 survivors publicly who has medical records. My friend Gianna Jessen, many of you probably know Gianna. We survived the same type of procedure. She has cerebral palsy as a result of lack of oxygen. But I went looking for my medical records, not knowing that they would be this important tool in this fight right now for life. It took me over 10 years to obtain my medical records. It took me over 10 years to find my biological parents. I ultimately really succeeded in meeting both those tasks back in 2007. My medical records, I share them before Congress, really anywhere in the world. They're pretty interesting. They say things like, a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. I know, right? We can laugh about it, don't worry. I laugh about it too, right? In a world that doesn't want to talk about what abortion is and what it does, I think it's fascinating that my medical records say that. They also list out a complication of pregnancy as a saline infusion in one of those parts. How interesting, right? You could say that it complicated things, and not just for me, but for my biological family. When I found out who my biological parents were, it was actually through my own medical records. After 10 years of searching for them my own way, God showed me once again that He's in charge of every little detail in our lives, because when they sent me my medical records, they committed a really big mistake. They forgot to black out my birth parents' names in one little corner. We would call that a HIPAA violation in today's world, right?
Yes, we would. Yes, we would.
I call that divine intervention. And you're never going to guess what I discovered when I started searching for them. You can guess I kind of have a perseverant attitude, right? Search for them for 10 years. I'm not afraid to go before Congress. I started searching for them that same night, and when I started searching, I learned that I was living in the very same city as my biological father. I moved to Sioux City, Iowa during my 10 years of searching, knowing that that's where my birth mother's abortion had supposedly taken place. But if you know that area of the country, it borders on Nebraska and South Dakota, and so I suspected my biological family wasn't even from that area. And of course, 30 years later, who would have thought that they were even there? My birth father was there. And after many months of praying about it, I reached out to him, sent him a letter in 2007 to his office and not his home. That was my way of protecting him a little bit. Told him all the things I've told you all tonight, and of course let him know, here we are in the very same city if you ever want to connect. Do you think I ever heard back from him?
No.
I don't know.
I actually didn't. I never heard back from him. And I had to learn to trust, right? And God's plans once again. I think it's easy to believe in God's will when things happen the way we want them to in this world. And it's a whole other thing to trust in His will when things happen otherwise. And so I had to trust once again that God had a plan that was greater. About that same time in 2007, I went searching for my birth mother. I couldn't find her through my searching, but I found her parents. That grandmother that I told you all about? Anybody else ever do things, look back on it and go, wow, I can't believe I did that? Every day of my life, that's me. I didn't know back then that my grandmother played the role in the abortion taking place that she did, but now that I know that, I am so grateful that I sent them a letter, because I think they needed to hear from me just as much as my birth mother did. My grandfather actually graciously replied to me. let me know some things about my birth mother's family. And they're not just the story of my birth family's lives, they're the story of many people's lives when it comes to abortion. So I want to share 2 of those points with you. One of the points he shared was that my birth mother had never told anyone about her abortion. And we know she's not alone in that. So many people, women and men in our world, carry the secret of an abortion throughout their lives. And I truly believe probably the greatest thing that has to happen in our culture for it to return to a culture of life is that we must heal. If we've lost nearly 60 million lives to abortion, then how many hundreds of millions of lives have actually been forever impacted? My birth mother is not alone in that experience. But my grandfather closed his letter with an interesting point, and that was that my messages wouldn't be passed along to her because they were completely estranged. And it makes sense, doesn't it? When we now know what really happened all those years ago, it makes great sense that their relationship has been forever changed. And so that was the last time I heard from my grandparents, was almost 12 years ago now. That's also when I came forward publicly as a survivor for the first time. What I didn't know is that as I was starting to travel the world in defense of life, my birth father was actually home fighting for his. That's why he never replied to my letter, because he passed away. And that was in early 2008, and like many people in that position, I questioned God, how that could be his plan. And God reminded me once again to be patient and trust his will. And as the months unfolded, I got to see God's plans. God's plans involved our oldest daughter, Olivia, being born at St. Luke's Hospital. Isn't that an amazing story of redemption? And trust me, I told God I wasn't going to do that either, but there I was. And not long after she was born, there some very important people came into my life, members of my biological father's family. When he died, they went to clean out his office and they found my letter tucked in his top desk drawer. So my grandfather and my great aunt very graciously entered into our lives, and my grandfather's still alive today. He is 91. I know where I get a little bit of my stubbornness from. And I wish I could tell you I was united with all of them, but abortion has forever impacted our family. And my grandmother passed away without ever being able to bring herself to meet me. And as hard as it is to see them go through that, though, I still have hope, because I know God's not done yet. He's still working in their lives, just like he's working in yours and he's working in mine. But as I close my time with you today, I want to share with you my other great source of hope. And that comes from seeing what has happened in my birth mother's family. Back in 2013, one of her cousins contacted me. That's how I found out this big news that the abortion was forced and my grandmother was responsible for so many things. My cousin connected me with my 2 half-sisters on my birth mother's side of the family, and also opened the lines of communication with my birth mother. Those were some interesting conversations for her and I to have, even by email initially. But there's one big reason why it was so difficult. There was one final big secret about my life that even my adoptive parents didn't know. And that's that my birth mother spent over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day at the hospital. They didn't tell her that I survived. She was simply told it's hideous, it's a monster, don't look at it. She didn't know if it was a little boy or a little girl that they had aborted in that abortion procedure, but what she did know was that she lived with incredible regret throughout her life. And the only reason why she found out about my survival was because I had come public with my story, which was the one thing I wanted to prevent from her being hurt. What I couldn't control was the fact that her parents, of course, had kept everything a secret over those years. How could I have ever known? My birth mother, as you can understand, really questioned how I could ever love her, how I could forgive any of them, and that's why it was so difficult for us to communicate. But we spent a few years building walls of trust and love with one another, and we met face to face for the first time about 3 years ago now. Isn't it amazing? I want to share with you the most amazing final piece of this story that I never ever saw coming. The reason why my birth mother's family connected with me in 2013 is because that's when we moved to Kansas City. What I never could have fathomed is that there was a detail about her life that I didn't know. Where do you think my birth mother lives?
Kansas City.
Wow.
My birth mother lives in Kansas City alongside one of my half-sisters. They live on the east side of town. My family and I live on the north side of town. My birth mother is now one of the biggest supports in my life. I am so blessed to have my adoptive parents, who are my mom and dad, and now be united with my biological mother. And I can tell you that if my birth mother was here tonight, she would thank each and every one of you, because she desperately wants every woman to have a different experience than what she went through in her life. And she is forever grateful for the courage and the sacrifice that all of us make in the pro-life movement, so that stories can be written so differently than hers and mine. So now you know the rest of the story that Congress doesn't know. So share it with them, right?
And I just want to know if you have a campus, if you have a campus presentation program, or if you're considering one, because I think your story, sure there are others, but yours that I heard is just so affecting. I can't believe the crazies would ever even think. I'm probably naive, but I can't believe there's no place for it on at least some campuses, and I'm wondering if you're doing anything.
That's a great question. So I don't get invited very often to speak on high school or college campuses, as you can probably imagine. But the good news is social media is powerful, right? So there's videos all over YouTube. There's the congressional video this week, not only of each of us testifying, but I think every person who identifies themselves as being pro-choice needs to watch the video of that Hollywood actress. Her name was Busy Phillips this week. She could not answer the question of when my human rights began or when my rights as a woman began. And I think every person who identifies as pro-choice needs to watch that video and ask themselves that same question, because in reality, no matter how good of an upbringing we give our kids, no matter how we raise them in the church, I think we all have to be honest with ourselves and say the culture that we live in indoctrinates people on a regular basis. I mean, God bless my 11-year-old. She saw a sign in Iowa recently that said abortion is health care. Went through the roof, right? Got out of the car. I had seen it. I had whispered something to my husband, right? So my 11-year-old gets out of the car, and the first words out of her mouth was, "Mom, did you see that sign? Please, abortion is not health care."
Yeah.
But my hope and prayer for her will continue to be that she is continuously told those same messages, right? I mean, I know she's protected by being raised in our family that knows the truth about abortion. But the power of our culture is huge. I hope to dismantle some of those lies that the abortion industry and that radical feminist movement put out. You will see a couple of documentaries coming out very soon that features multiple stories of abortion survivors. We're working on some individually also, but you will see survivors more and more coming forward, because I've had contact with 287 other abortion survivors, range in age from babies. So I know of babies who survived both chemical abortion pills, not just reversals, but literally survived both doses of the chemical abortion pill. So I have babies, and I have people into their 60s and 70s who survived illegal abortions. So I was telling Chris today at lunch, most survivors are raised in their biological family. That's part of the reason why most survivors don't come forward with their story, because there's a lot of family secrets to keep, right? A lot of protection that has to take place. But my hope is that the more survivors are brought healing, which is part of the work that I do behind the scenes, the more that we'll see survivors come forward with their stories. But I can tell you that seeing things like New York happen have ignited a passion within survivors who are saying, no more, right? It was enough to hurt me, but I'm not gonna allow you to hurt anybody else.
I think people are frightened by what.
No.
I was frightened when I heard it.
What's your social media? Do you have a website, Melissa?
Yes, so my last name is spelled O-H-D-E-N, so it's Melissa Ohden, OHDEN.com. You can find me on Instagram, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, all of those things.
Make it go viral, everybody.
Yeah, well, and that's the hope, right? I have learned that I have to capture the media's attention myself and not wait for them to do it, right? I'd be waiting here, listening to crickets chirp. A question back there, and then move over here.
I have 3 questions for you. First question is, are you or have you made a Prager video? You know, the 5-minute Prager University video.
We have not, but that's come up a lot lately.
Number 2, the estimate on the number of abortion survivors varies between a couple of thousand to 40,000.
That's correct.
And let me get to my third question. The third question is, and it's directly related to the fact that most abortion survivors are within families. With abortion doctors and Planned Parenthood and affiliated organizations promoting culling and fetal reduction. That means there are hundreds of thousands of abortion survivors.
Yeah.
Can you address those things?
Yeah, so he was asking us about a PragerU video. I have not done one yet. There's going to be lots of different videos coming out very soon. The number of abortion survivors is very, very difficult to get to. That 40,000 actually came out of our network. I'll have to dig that data out and repost it. But there was a researcher, about 10 years ago, who had looked at the failure rates of CDC data on late-term abortions only, and looking through her statistics, and I've seen her comp it out. I've watched the whole thing. She calculated there could be as many as 44,000 survivors of late-term abortion in the United States alone. Now, when we talk about abortion survivors and you talk about born alive legislation, you hear lots of people saying recently, right, well, this doesn't happen. There are a few states that report out survivors of abortion. Florida, Michigan, and Minnesota are 3 of those. You can look through those reports if you go to the Abortion Survivors Network for our Facebook page. We also have, and you'll find it on Twitter too. But they actually have state reports that identify the number of children who survive abortions. The numbers, of course, in the grand scheme of things are small in the face of lives lost, but those reports are out there. Now, when people are talking about born alive laws not being needed, the problem that exists is that historically, the states have not been required to report out when lives like mine happen and what type of medical care is being provided. So, for instance, in North Carolina, where they did a vote again this week in the House to override the governor's veto of born alive legislation. By the way, it didn't pass. They didn't get a 3/5 majority to override his veto. So that means the born alive bill did not pass. But what we saw happening was that within that piece of legislation, if that would have passed, not only would it provide a consequence if medical providers didn't provide us immediate medical care, but they would also have to start tracking the data. And so that's another reason why born alive legislation is so important to me, because we need to start knowing how often this happens and what happens to survivors like me. I read through the Minnesota report that came out not too long ago, and one of the 3 lives identified in that year, it listed out, no comments were left about whether any medical care was provided or what the outcome was. And I read the report and I contacted people in Minnesota and said, did anybody find out what happened to this child? Tell me what happened. And they said, oh, I guess nobody's ever inquired about that before. So unless we ask, they aren't going to compile the information. So when people try to tell you that this doesn't happen, you can simply say, we haven't been tracking the data to tell us that it doesn't.